Hi, and welcome to Critical Myth Theory. My name is Joel.
My name is Alexander. Let's get into it.
Alright, so today we are going to be talking about the 7 books of Harry Potter, as well as, I guess, the 8 movies and how they...
Movies, yeah.
8 movies, and how they overlap. We're going to be leaving Fantastic Beasts and the Cursed Child out. One of them being a piece of fan fiction, and the other one being quite irrelevant to this specific story.
Yeah.
One of them's more like modern era, and the other one's definitely our postmodern era.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So why are we talking about Harry Potter?
So what I think is, I think it's a natural progression. Really, we're coming from having talked about Tolkien and then Lewis. We're kind of seeing the trend throughout the 1900s of fantasy kind of developing and becoming what it is. And the next big thing I think that comes to people's mind when we talk about fantasy is clearly going to be Harry Potter, at least in the timeline, right? We got the series as a movie series as well. It was the second most popular fantasy movie series, and still say even today, but an adaptation I should say.
Yeah, because Star Wars is up there.
Yeah, exactly. And I want to specify you say movies because obviously there's Game of Thrones, but so I guess our definition of this is very specific. But neither here nor there. I think it definitely fills into this category because in a sense it kind of carries on the tradition of fantasy while it being a very unique thing. It's by no means a carbon copy of Lord of the Rings, but you can definitely see its evolution of it, right? And I would almost I'm quicker to compare it to Narnia, just because we see similar elements of these modern day British kids who are pulled into this fantasy world apart from our own world that exists alongside, right? So there's this obviously very common theme there, but then there's obviously you were mentioning something that was actually quite different than in those two.
Yeah, do you know it's kind of interesting to watch that. Well, with Lord of the Rings, it's very much our world is pretty much irrelevant to Middle Earth. In fact, who's to say our world exists when we're considering Middle Earth? And it doesn't matter. Our world's completely inconsequential.
Right.
Whereas Narnia, it's very much... Well, here's a big difference between Narnia's interaction with our world versus Harry Potter's magical world interacting with our world.
Right.
So there's definitely a more fluidity there, but in Narnia it's a lot more... Narnia could do without Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, and all the other...
Sons of Adam?
Yeah, and Daughters of Eve.
Right.
But it's good that they are there.
Right.
But Narnia is not contingent on their existence.
Right.
You might say yes because prophecies and whatnot, but I kind of say back, why not just have a different prophecy then?
Sure.
But Harry Potter, it's very much, if you are born into the wizarding world, you are a wizard, and it is wrong for you not to be a wizard.
Right.
And you will be going to this school called Hogwarts. Assuming you're British.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah. So the veil keeps getting thinner and thinner between
right.
our world and the magical or the supernatural world.
Yeah.
Although in Harry Potter it's not exactly supernatural as it is magical, which is another thing.
Yeah.
It's actually something that also gets divided a little bit more.
That's true, and it's funny too because I'm just going to kind of bring up this random thing that we see when the veil becomes thinner is this attempt to hide it, and this almost like this playful attempt to show it and then to hide it, right? There's always this element of people trying to peep in and find it, right? You have a little bit of that in Narnia, but barely. But then in Harry Potter it's a bit more, and then as we get more and more common, we start to see that more and more, like with secret identities and superheroes, right? Like there's always this who is it kind of mentality, right? And so I think as the veil becomes thinner and thinner, there's always this trying to hide it from the others, from the normals.
Well, there's also another thing that it's kind of specific, but I think that this highlights the point as well, is that Narnia is very disattached from the political realm in in our world, I mean, that's highlighted in Eustace on the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. You know, he's talking about bringing the British Council into things, and everybody's just, you have a laugh at this absolute, you know, he's completely out of his element.
Oh yeah.
Whereas, you know, very non-political place. Whereas with Harry Potter, you see interactions between the Ministry of Magic and the Prime Minister of England. So it's
Right.
so there's actually that political element that is not there in, because it's not straight mythology anymore. It's our world.
Right. But I think a big part of that too is also, if you look at the worlds apart from humans, Narnia is just what, talking animals,
Mm-hmm.
whereas Harry Potter without humans, like the Wizarding World without humans is what, goblins and elves. Like there's very few sentient beings that would be able to rule and run things, and so the reason that there's more government in the Harry Potter world is because government's naturally a human thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so if, because humans are in control of the Wizarding World, of course there's going to be government.
Yeah, and I think the centaurs kind of
Yeah, that's
ironically, I think that they would disdain having government over other creatures because they're too good for it or something like that.
That's too different, right? Yeah.
Oh well.
But one of the interesting things, and I kind of want to touch on this point, I think, with movies in particular, as we talk about how Harry Potter is a very generational thing, right? A lot of kids will actually grow up kind of reading the same time, almost the same age as Harry, and as they kind of get through, because it's 7 books, that's 7 years of a child's life going into, young teenage years, and you can kind of tie yourself closer to the character because you're seeing the lens through the character, and I think a big strength of something like Lord of the Rings and the movie making production was they made all the movies at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes sense because the stories were all back to back. Whereas Harry Potter, they couldn't have done that, and it's good that they didn't. Because of the fact that these actors who are playing these characters are coming back and they're becoming older themselves. There's almost like this, I try not to involve my interest in actors in their lives, but I always found it interesting seeing Daniel Radcliffe and Emma Watson and Rupert.
Grint.
Yes, yeah. Kind of seeing their interactions with each other as they grew older into these series and into their characters, and then seeing how they almost acted like their characters as well, even outside of the films. And I thought that was very interesting. But yeah, I mean, that's a big benefit to the movies is that they weren't done. They were done kind of along the age of the characters that they needed to be presenting. I thought that was actually a really well done thing that takes a lot of planning.
Mm-hmm. And also in another way that it's generational. I mean, one thing that Lord of the Rings has, and we were talking about this earlier, is that you kind of have to explore the universe at its level. It's like, here's magic. You got to put in a bit of a, and it's not as if it were complicated or too high to understand or anything, but there's a high element to it. You've actually got to put your head into it. Mm-hmm. In that sense. And if you're going to be interested in that world, it's very much, you're going to have to put yourself into it. Whereas Harry Potter is this, and I'm not attributing value to this, by the way, as if it were good or bad. With Harry Potter, it's very much, let's bring the magical world to the people.
Mm-hmm.
So let's bring it down to their level. And there are some ways where it's a little bit more, you say the words and you wave your wand and it does this and this thing. So it's like kind of a basic type of thing.
Yeah.
But you're very much, because it's so connected with our world, you're very much hoping for that letter for Hogwarts when you're a kid.
Yeah, I think if I had to suggest, I think that the times of which they were written and by the authors that they were written actually demonstrates that. Because you look at something like Lord of the Rings, who's written by Tolkien, who's gone to war, who's seen war with his own eyes, and he wrote it kind of during the time of this massive war thing, where young men were not able to go to school, but instead they're drawn from their homes to go fight on the war front into this massive wide world with no real lessons or training. They're just thrown into the deep end, as it were, and having to fight, right? And you see that with Lord of the Rings, where the hobbits are basically thrown into this wide world. There's no classes or lessons or anything like that. It's just the stakes are so high almost immediately, if not immediately. Whereas Harry Potter, very different, because again the author would have been in this this age of we're at peace and we're learning. She's writing to students, not to people who are going off to war. And so the people that are in her stories are actually going to be, students. They're learning things and they're kind of delving into the nitty gritty of the magical world. And so it really speaks to the audience and to the authors who wrote it. And I think that actually, again, and we see the stakes. I mean, sometimes the stakes are something as, not failing a class. And yeah, sometimes the stakes are the end of the world, or at least the end of the Wizarding World in some terms of Harry Potter. But like, the stakes gradually grow as the reader kind of grows in maturity. And I think that kind of shows as well in the age. I guess it was like this coming of age story as well in the fantasy world, where you're about to graduate high school. The stakes are a bit higher than they were in grade school, right? So that's fair. But at the same time, of course, it has to have that fantasy element of keeping the stakes quite a bit higher as well. So I always like that kind of theme. Whereas, Lord of the Rings is literally, at the end of the world at the beginning of the book.
Yeah.
Very threatening an apocalypse.
Well, they're full on new ages in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
now we've just started on a whole new age.
Mm-hmm.
This one, it's more of a restoration, perhaps, which Lord of the Rings absolutely is, but it's more let's get back to the way that things are supposed to be, rather than let's start this new age.
Right.
I think we can dive into some of the themes.
Yeah, for sure. That's good. Good timing.
I think one of the important ones to talk about, and I think we might have very briefly alluded to it in Lord of the Rings, but I think that this is going to be valuable for both this episode as well as the next.
Right.
Is the theme of the Chosen One.
Yeah, we can't really avoid it. Again, you talked about how it's in Lord of the Rings. It's even in Narnia.
Yep.
Right? There's 4 chosen ones, but they're still chosen to do certain things. Anytime you have any sort of prophecies, you get chosen ones. But in this particular case, right, like Harry is the chosen one, obviously.
I think we can break down what the Chosen One is. The Chosen One kind of implies this inescapable eternal finger pointing at this person to be the hero, because it's not just a chosen one, it is the chosen one, and it's not as if that "the" is going to be changed.
Right, exactly.
Or that "the," because there's not a vowel after that "the." But it's also interesting that when you see, let's say, and we're definitely going to dive into this one in Star Wars episode, which is next. It's really interesting to see that the best of the chosen ones are the ones that are unwillingly given that response, who unwillingly need to take up that responsibility. Or sorry, not unwillingly, but they. It's not that they want power.
Well,
It's given to them. It's Harry as a baby is marked by evil.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not even his own doing, and it's not his choice, but it just is.
Mm-hmm.
And he's got to live with the consequences of the actions outside of him. He's been chosen.
Yeah.
No matter what he wants to do in his life.
Exactly. I mean, it's obviously this role of fate and this other guiding hand behind it, right? And I think that's because, again, we're talking about prophecies. That's always a very big... That's the guiding force. So there's no real chosen one if there's no prophecies, right? And so that's kind of the whole point of the chosen one, is living up to the prophecy. And so there's this guiding hand of fate. Lord of the Rings had it where, Frodo was meant to take the ring. He was meant to find the ring, and he was meant to... Bilbo was meant to find the ring, and Frodo was meant to have the ring to bear. That's obviously, we're talking about something greater than what you can see with your eyes. There's obviously some guiding providential hand going in the background. So anytime we have any sort of prophecy, that's exactly what's going on. And so, because chosen refers to 2 individuals. You can't be chosen unless someone chooses you, right? So when we refer to Harry being the chosen one, who's he being chosen by? Now, you can maybe look at this from like a Stoic perspective of fate is this guiding thing, this impersonal force that's driving everything, and Star Wars might even have the same kind of thing, the all-knowing force. Now, of course, as Christians, and I know Tolkien and Lewis would have the same kind of idea as us, in that there's obviously a more personal take on things, more personal sovereign hand going behind the scenes of these prophecies and choosing people. But it's interesting because choice again kind of determines it kind of implies at least a personality behind the sovereign force.
It's really strange in Harry Potter because it's not as if it were some. It's not as if God specifically were choosing Harry. It's actually the actions of Voldemort that bring about the prophecy. So the prophecy is stated by Trelawney, to which Voldemort gets wind of via Snape. And then he acts on it, but he didn't have to, and the prophecy, and it's stressed that the prophecy would not have been fulfilled if he chose not to act on it. But based on the information, the limited information he had, and the misunderstanding that he had of the way that prophecies worked, he ironically plays his part in fulfilling the prophecy, to which Harry necessarily needs to take his part in fulfilling his side of the prophecy.
Yeah.
So it's really this question of was it the two people involved who chose, or was it fate from the beginning that decided this is how it's going to be, and it's going to be sort of an ironic play out?
Yeah, and that irony kind of suggests a sense of humor, I would suggest. Right, and I think, again, I'm going to pull this to a Christian perspective, right? I mean, we see the same thing being played out in the life of Christ. Right? I mean, the most obvious example of a real life chosen one is Jesus, how he fulfills all the ancient prophecies of the world, and yet Satan knew this. He saw all these things, these prophecies being fulfilled in him, and so he knew he had to go and kill him. But what was the prophecy? The prophecy was that he would be, his heel would be stricken by the serpent, but he would crush the head of him. Right? That's the first prophecy ever told, and by so being afraid of this prophecy, Satan got his heels his own doom in that sense.
And it's ironic because he just doesn't understand self-sacrifice and love in that sense, and neither does Voldemort. So these are the forces that stop both Satan and Voldemort in that way. It's love and self-sacrifice. So there's a real Christian illusion there.
Yeah, for sure. Whether or not it's intentional is a different story, but yeah, absolutely.
I kind of think that it's somewhat intentional because I think that she pulled mythology from everywhere in this case.
I mean, my age-old argument is that like any good story is going to pull from that because it has to, because our conventions of good storytelling come from that very first.
They're
prophecy.
Very ancient.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's core to our human nature to understand that prophecy as the prophecy of the crushing of the serpent's head and the striking of his heel. That is the theme of our storytelling today. We don't have stories that don't talk about that sort of thing today. Right?
Although I might argue that we're beginning to, and very purposefully too, but those are for later episodes that I'm so looking forward to.
But yeah, the best stories are basically just a rip off the old formula.
Yeah. Yep. So, getting back to this chosen one theme, is it the participants of the prophecy who are making it happen, or is it in Harry's perspective, it doesn't really matter. It does for Voldemort. For him, it doesn't, because Voldemort's already chosen to take that step to force Harry to follow the prophecy. And Harry even kind of understands this. It's the difference between, if it were determined by fate, it would be as if he were dragged onto the battlefield unwillingly, kicking and screaming and having to force a fight against Voldemort. Or Voldemort would be forcing that fight, I should say. But the way that he sees it, it's because Voldemort has voluntarily and unknowingly, ironically, decided that this prophecy was going to happen no matter what he did. He has decided that he is going to engage in the prophecy, and so since it's kind of a choice by that one participant that forces Harry, the second participant, to go out and fight, it's as if he were entering an arena willingly, because it's, well, he's fighting against men, and it's debatable how much of a man he is left, but it's very much this good versus evil rather than this good and evil versus fate or anything like that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is a very tough debate when it comes to fate in particular, right? Like, it comes from your worldview. If you're, and even Christians aren't exactly free from this debate either, right? I mean, the idea of predetermined predestination and whatever else is one of the most widely debated topics among Christianity, right? Are we chosen because we choose Christ, or does Christ choose us, and that's because of the power to choose Him? It's kind of the question between Calvinism and Arminianism is a good example of that. It's the same kind of battle going on, right? But at the end of the day, how practical is all that information, right? How practical would it have been for Voldemort to know that he was being led by the hands of fate or by his own will? He still would have done what he'd done, right? Would that have changed his mind on how he did things? Who knows? But
that's a good point to bring up.
Right.
Yeah, he would have done the same thing either way, but perhaps differently, because he is, he will always be what he has decided to be, which is exactly what it is, because it's the choice that matters. It's in the second book. Dumbledore says to Harry, "It's your decisions. It's not so much what the hand that you're dealt that matters, in terms of your skills and your abilities. That matters, but how are you going to use them? Which way are you going to go? How are you going to use those the forks in the road? Like, where are you going to go with this?"
Yeah.
And he chooses. He's got all these elements, the Gryffindor and the Slytherin, the Ravenclaw element, all to him, and maybe the Hufflepuff, but I don't think that was really specified by the Sorting Hat. But he's got these elements to him. He always picks the courageous path. He always picks the heroic path. And not to say that one of the house's values is better than the other, but in the case of heroism, it's courage that is needed.
Right. Remind me again if I'm wrong. Is there not a section of the books that Harry wrestles with the idea that he could have very easily turned out to be like Voldemort? He's on a similar path.
Yeah, that was in the second book. He's able to speak with snakes, Parseltongue, in which he gets, he kind of gets, because Voldemort marked him, essentially. So he gains. So there's a piece of Voldemort inside him. There's a piece of evil inside of him, almost like a yin-yang type of thing.
Right.
And he's able to then speak with snakes, and so it's Ron even says that it's not associated with anything good. Usually it's the bad wizards who can speak with snakes, and Salazar Slytherin being a pretty sketchy guy himself, the founder of the Slytherin house.
Well, I think at one point Ron says, because this is the age-old kind of all SRP kind of
all SRP.
Right, he would basically say, not all Slytherin are bad guys, but all bad guys are Slytherin.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
There wasn't a wizard who's gone bad that wasn't Slytherin, right?
Which ironically, at the end of that book, Quirrell being a Ravenclaw,
right?
He went bad, and there was talk about Sirius Black before they thought that he went bad.
Right.
Yeah, and what's his name? Peter Pettigrew. He was a Gryffindor who went bad years ago.
That's right.
So,
that's right.
So
while it's not true, but it definitely
But I think that's something that we can talk about. Is sort of Slytherin and Gryffindor. Sort of this the values of Slytherin versus the values of Gryffindor. Because throughout the books we're kind of Team Gryffindor and fight against Team Slytherin. Kind of naturally so, seeing as our main protagonists, most of them are in Gryffindor. And between the three, all three of them are in Gryffindor.
Yeah.
But I kind of wanted to talk about this because I don't think that in the books Slytherin is dealt. I don't want to call it I don't want to say that they were dealt an unfair hand. I think they needed to be the antithesis.
Sure.
But their values were at their worst during the time that the books are placed.
Kind of thinking about this, actually, I think I almost want to twist your argument differently, because what I would say is it's almost like a personality test where you have your primary and your secondary, right? So something like ambition and power are good secondary motivations, never good primary motivations. Courage and responsibility are good primary motivations. And the moment you switch
really
those around, the moment you switch those around and you make ambition and power your primary motivation, then suddenly it corrupts you.
Yeah. No, actually, I totally agree with that.
It's almost making it like your power source, whereas courage and responsibility should be your power source. They're both of them going to be very potent and necessary. Ambition and power are good things, but again, making them on the top instead of putting them in their appropriate place.
The thing is, when we're seeing at the beginning of the origins between Salazar Slytherin and Godric Gryffindor, it's sort of they are the closest of friends, and I think that was when things were doing well. You have some of those things that tilt towards darkness sooner than what is light,
right,
such as ambition and power, and those things that tilt towards what is light sooner than darkness, such as courage and responsibility. But I think that without each other, one turns innocuous and useless, and the other one turns tyrannical. So ambition and power becomes tyrannical when it's without the use of anything good, such as courage and responsibility, let's say, which is what Gryffindor seems to be the exemplar of. But courage and responsibility, what's the point if you have no power to be courageous over or against anything, or no power to have any responsibility for anything?
To even kind of further this conversation into the other houses too, I was talking earlier about how we see kind of Harry, who's the Slytherin stand-in for Gryffindor, right? He was almost chosen to be Slytherin until he decided to choose Gryffindor. And then I would argue that Hermione is kind of the Ravenclaw Gryffindor, and Ron is the Hufflepuff Gryffindor, right? He represents that personality kind of perfectly. But what I would suggest then is that courage and responsibility are actually kind of the building block, right? They are the core, the cornerstone of the others, right? Because knowledge without courage and responsibility, I mean, Ravenclaw wasn't at all, other than, what do we see? Like, we saw Luna, but there was no other characters that were really involved in the takeover of the main plot going on. They were hiding behind their books. There's no courage or responsibility in what they were doing. They were just gathering knowledge. Yeah. Right? And so it's maybe not, active evil, but it's passive evil. Right? Because not living up to that responsibility of something will be, you're negligent. And same thing with Hufflepuff and their aloofness and their...
they might have a propensity towards sloth.
Yeah, exactly.
Or gluttony or something like that.
Without courage and responsibility, they themselves fall into the same kind of category of even passive evil, but still.
And to deal Hufflepuff a good hand, I kind of think that at their best, they sort of have this Epicurean kind of content with just being happy with what they have and just showing good to others, which I actually can't stress enough. That is really, really good quality to have. Yeah. Which is just, this community, love each other, live contently. Yeah. Don't want more than you need.
But I think that community, when it's given, or when it's shone a light on by responsibility and it doesn't live up to it, it fails morally.
Oh yeah.
Right, and I think that I'm going to be bringing back a lot of content to Lord of the Rings and the Hobbits, so bear with me.
Well, we already have, and they already know.
So, like, the Hobbits kind of represent that, that kind of peaceful, happy living of contentment. Yeah. Right, we have no adventures here. We're all very happy with where we are. But every single time Bilbo is wrestling with his inner personalities, he's always talking about those Tookish moments when his courage kind of takes over. and it's almost brought upon in a good light. And it's the entire book is this wouldn't have happened if Bilbo never took on his too courageous side,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so that courage is always shown on a good light, in and above and beyond the peaceful living. Because, I mean, again, Tolkien's gonna show this in the war. What's the point of living a peaceful life if you don't have the courage to fight for it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think we see that too in Harry Potter, right? These students know that things are going on badly, but yet there's only 3 of them that are ever really doing anything about it, right?
And I might say that it's probably not the best system to have 4 houses with some very specific values not benefiting from each other.
Right. There's
I think that
obviously
it
a
would
lot
be
of overlap and whatever else too, right? So
it would be really nice to see them work together, which you do see at the end, with
Mhm.
the exception of maybe Slytherin, who is given that choice of, do you want to be on side A or side B?
Yeah.
Like, do you want to cooperate with us, or do you want to be against us? And you've got to choose, and we are giving you time to choose. But at least for the other 3 houses, at least in a time of crisis, they come together. Even so, during times in prosperity, let's say for Hogwarts, they seem to be pretty against each other, and it's kind of no wonder, points to Gryffindor or points to Ravenclaw, take some points away from Hufflepuff or something like that. And Quidditch is almost competitive to the point of religious experience. It's
yeah, but that's just sports in general. That's a good analogy for sports, not real life.
yeah, oh yeah, but I just kind of wonder, like, oh man, nothing against Rowling. It's more like against the characters within the books itself, which is ironic.
Yeah.
You could treat the world as a living thing apart from the author.
Exactly.
But I just kind of wonder, you founding fathers of the school, you really set this one up for a bit of failure, not teaching all these.
Well, that's the thing. I think that without courage and responsibility, all of them have moral shortcomings, which is ironically the those 2 things are what Gryffindor is. So it's almost like Gryffindor has the responsibility, if you will, of moral uprightness, more so than the other 2, because they represent the core of morality and the courage and responsibility. But
no, it could be. But if I kind of was thinking we'd talk about Slytherin a little bit more specifically and sort of their extremes, the Death Eaters, like the Death Eaters party versus the
Purity?
Gryffindor party. No, a purity after. So Death Eaters talk, and some of the extreme Slytherins, which there's plenty of them in the books. Their version of purity is very different from our protagonist's version of purity. And one of them that we see is in the form of blood and lineage.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, in terms of the families, there's the Sacred 28, a bunch of which, if not most, are in Slytherin. Because Slytherin was very concerned with having pure blood. Now, at the time, it was, let's make sure that there isn't any traitors, because times of killing people who had magic. Now, I'm pretty sure that Slytherin himself probably had some prejudice against Muggles himself, but in this case, it's kind of turned to be anyone who's not pure blood is worse than me.
Right.
And these are very, and I'm not saying, because I don't want to say that it's invaluable entirely, because there's deep, rich history with family lineage as well that you don't kind of that you don't want to take lightly either. But it's also very outward, It's whatever you have nice lineage, and therefore you have influence. It doesn't worry about the moral character.
Yeah, I mean, lineage should never determine value.
Exactly.
Right, because we all of us come from. I mean, we believe that we all of us come from one particular person.
Yeah.
Right, and so to even suggest that there's more than one race is kind of it's just incorrect, because we are all of us
or a better
human
version
race.
of that race.
Exactly. There's no intrinsic value in who our ancestors were.
Yeah, but it is cool historically.
Sure, and there can be value gained from it, but it's not value intrinsically. It's not as like personal value, right?
Mm-hmm.
No person is better, but there's, I'd say, something to be gained from, the historic bloodline of households insofar as maybe role or like roles is a good thing because roles and value are very different things, right? You can be a garbage man, or you could be a king, and yet you're still going to have the same intrinsic value as a human being. And so if you're, this is how, historically speaking, would have always been.
Nothing against kings, of course.
No, of course. But that's kind of my point, is that the roles and the values shouldn't, and often they do, right? We see that kind of being the case. People attribute a role and represent it as a greater or lesser value, right? Because especially in that example, a king would almost assume that he's greater value because he's a king.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really just the role that he plays. A good king recognizes that he has just as much value as the quote unquote lowliest peasant, because really they're all of them made from dust.
Yeah, equality of souls.
Yeah, exactly. Equality of souls, but not necessarily the same roles.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a nice little rhyme.
It's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
And we're talking about Harry Potter's purity. It's very much from the heart. He's got friends around him, and he's always looking out for them, and they're always looking out for him.
Mm-hmm.
And he's protected by his mother's sacrifice, which in itself was a very pure thing to do.
Right.
And she was a very pure person as well. Like, he's surrounded in a sense. Like, there's an element of darkness in him that is foreign to him, but it is in him.
Right.
But what he has in the dark elements of him, such as Parseltongue, he uses for good.
Right. Would you say that there's a resemblance then, in terms of like the Nazi ideal of Nietzsche's Übermensch, the Superman, in terms of Slytherin and the Death Eaters, versus the Superman as the comic book artists and authors have taken to be, submitting to a greater, more moral value, not creating their own.
Ooh. So you're talking about, let's say, Nietzsche's Superman versus America's Superman, for example.
Exactly. Because that's kind of I would say the same kind of thing, right? Like, Malfoy's and Voldemort's of the world are basically determining what is good and evil based on what works for them, because they're above good and evil almost. They determine it. Right?
Well, Voldemort definitely.
Yeah. I say Malfoy's because he's just another. He's kind of the stand-in for our hero's rival, as it were. Right?
Yeah.
Whereas Harry, his purity doesn't come from himself. He's not determining his own purity. We as the readers see him submitting to a greater good. And so we recognize, he's actually submitting to this higher moral authority that's greater than himself.
It was exactly what we're talking about when we're saying that the good person does not put himself as the arbiter between good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't say that he will give what is due to good to himself in order for him to later do what is good. Chances are he doesn't play out that way. And chances are, if you're doing something good, it's not going to benefit you all that much.
Right. Yeah. Which I think is a good slide into one of our other topics, because I think this kind of touches on a previous conversation we had with Lewis, where he often would talk about, where you're saying that doing the greater good doesn't always lead to our own personal benefit. And yet, here we have, in Harry Potter, this theme of breaking the rules, but for the greater good.
Yeah.
And that happens all the time. And it would make Kant turn around in his grave, should he read this series for that reason. Right? How many times does Dumbledore, for example, close a blind eye to things going on that are rule-breaking, but he knows that they're for the greater good, especially when he gives... the example I give is the saving of Buckbeak and Sirius Black. He gives a time turner to Hermione and pretends that he didn't see anything.
Yeah.
Right? Any good Kantian... If Dumbledore was a Kantian, none of that would have happened.
Oh, yeah. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you could have saved him or not. You have to save him by lawful means.
Yeah. right? Which is definitely not how he did it.
Yeah.
But even then, I would still suggest that it wasn't for their own personal gain.
Yeah.
Right? We see Harry how many times he didn't. Yeah, maybe he was breaking the rules by even, let's say, even in the very first one, right? He goes and breaks the rules of going down where he's told not to go, past Fluffy. Right?
Well, he's risking his life.
Yeah,
it's not as if he's like going on a bloody adventure. It's like, no, there's a high likelihood that you 11-year-old are going to die.
Yeah.
And there's another one that to point out in the Order of the Phoenix is he defies Dolores Umbridge, and well, he and Hermione, and they escape to the Forbidden Forest. So, there's a multitude of unlawful things that they've just done.
Mm-hmm.
But it's to fight Voldemort at the Ministry of Magic, risking both their lives and probably their chances of returning next year if the Ministry is still in control.
Right.
So these are the types of breaking the rules, but not for their own sake, but for the greater good.
Yeah.
And this is the true definition of breaking the rules for the greater good, not as if it were like for the greater good. It's it will as if it were my definition of what was the greater good, but this is actually a genuine selfless breaking the rules.
Although there's an ironic thing here, I guess the kind of the stick in the mud to this conversation, of course, is going to be Ron's twin brothers.
Who
do break the rules for their own personal gain, and at the same time, sometimes they line it up with a greater good. Sorry, with Dolores, for example, when they crash the exams and that whole thing, they obviously did it for their own pleasure.
Yeah,
but I also don't think
there's a just element to it, and you know what? I don't think that there's anything in the series where you could say that they're bad. They're mischievous,
they're breaking the rules.
They're breaking the rules, but they're not. It's not malicious, ever.
But it's selfish, which makes it malicious. I would suggest.
No, I think that malicious is a little like I see what you're getting at. I think malicious is a little bit too harsh of a word.
Right.
But selfish, perhaps, I would say.
So, like, for example, right, we see them giving the Marauders map to Harry.
Yeah.
Right? And obviously they would have used it to prank people and go around and do whatever else and avoid punishment for their... avoid just punishment for their mischievous actions. Whereas Harry, of course, takes it on and doesn't do so. He instead uses it for the greater good.
Yeah. Although, sometimes not. There's a lot of temptation with that kind of power. Like he sneaks into Hogsmeade at one point.
That's right.
Like he uses the Marauders map is definitely that ambiguous type of item that he has. He can use it for good or for evil, and he uses it for both. It's a very tempting thing that he has. Mm-hmm. And I kind of want to point to the words of the Marauders map. It's I solemnly swear that I am up to no good.
Yeah.
It's like you're bound, technically speaking, by an oath, and I'm sure that it has power in terms of magic. But even if it's just a joke, it's like,
what's that? No good. Is it a smaller good or a greater good? Because then Harry could never use it for good.
It is clearly an item of mischief,
mm-hmm.
and ironically, this item of mischief ends up being used for good, at least often enough for it not to be considered a malicious item, but definitely a mischievous one.
I'm going to go off on a completely different tangent here, and I apologize.
Let's go for it.
I'm just getting kind of this thought in my head. So, in Norse mythology, when you get someone like Loki, who is actually the god of mischief, but during the later stages, and people will often point to the demonization of Loki in terms of the Christian culture coming into the Norse mythology. Sure, we can talk about that discussion, but it's kind of cool to see the lineage of, the timeline of Loki's progression, because he doesn't start off as evil. At the end of by the time Ragnarok comes around, he is full on evil, but he starts off as just simply mischievous, right? Stealing Freya's hair and whatever else he does as simply mischievous, never really malicious. Eventually, I can't remember which event is the one that you would kind of draw the line and say, no, that was actually malicious, not mischievous. But there is certainly this progression that Loki has as a character in Norse mythology, regardless of what the movies will tell you in terms of Marvel superheroes. But actual Norse mythology, you get into the background of Loki as a mischievous, eventually becoming malicious character, which is always an interesting role. But anyways,
That's really cool. And then I guess Fred and George kind of they sort of move the other way with it, and they use what is it like? They were Weasley Wizard Wheezes. They use it almost as this fight for justice type of thing. Now it goes overboard, like you wouldn't believe sometimes, but it actually ends up being used for good far more often than it is used for evil. And even then, it's kind of murky as to whether you call it good or evil, because there's love potions, and then there's like weird. There's a bunch of weird stuff going on with it, but it's humor. And humor bends rules.
Yeah, that's by its definition, it's going to be antithetical to good.
But humor,
to justness. Yeah,
but
fair.
humor, well, good and truth can be pretty serious. But I don't think that I don't think that it's necessarily against humor. And I don't think that I think humor is overall a good thing. It could be used poorly and it could be used badly. It is once again a tool. But I don't know where I heard this, and I think it's right that humor is, that truth is nothing makes people laugh like the truth. So humor and the truth actually go together a lot, because if it isn't relevant and if it's false, you're probably not going to laugh at it. It's just going to be like, hang on, that's not true.
Yeah.
But if it's pointing out uncomfortable truths, and if it's poking at things, which I think a lot of these inventions of Fred and George do, just kind of poking at things and poking at weak spots all the time.
I'll challenge that though.
Constantly, I might say that, okay, I'm excited for that, but constantly challenging all these different, a lot of these weaker and perhaps tyrannical elements, bringing down the bad parts of order, some of the tyrannical parts of order. There is a good use of humor.
Right.
It can be destructive, and it often is, but there's a good use in it, and I think that Fred and George overall end up using it more for good than they do for bad.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, humor is also a very, what I would suggest, a very good humbler. Oh, that's a good word.
Oh, yeah.
Right, but because I'm going to use examples of biblical examples of humor.
But that's not contradicting what I said.
No, it's not contradicting at all. I'm actually reinforcing your point here. I'm going to contradict it later. Don't worry.
Oh,
maybe. Let's see. So to reinforce your point, we got the biblical examples of humor. We actually just recently had a sermon series on the book of Esther, and it was kind of taken from the perspective of being a satire, right? It's basically God pointing down to this mighty king, Ahasuerus, Xerxes, mighty king of Persia, and kind of showing his faults and how easily he's overthrown by his wife's posture of saying no and whatever else. Like, there's a lot of comedy involved in that story, in just the irony of things going on, and there's almost divine providential comedy going on in the background. Or another example of that would be God being very sarcastic with Job as a good way of humiliating him or humbling him, right? Where he's very sarcastic, right? Job kind of finishes what he has to say, his friends also finish what he has to say, and God steps in and says, "So Job, before I answer your question, let me how about you answer mine?" And then he says,
I've seen your resume,
yeah.
So let's go over it a quick second.
Well, it's very sarcastic. He's like, where were you when I laid the oceans from my hands? Surely you were there when I put Leviathan in the waters. I mean, clearly you know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
He's being extremely sarcastic to make him prove a point of being just extremely humble. Now, for the little poking a hole in your theory of how humor... Wait, what did you say? Humor has truth in it.
Or nothing makes people laugh more than the truth.
Yes. Why do ducks have tail feathers? To cover their butt wax. See? It's comical, but it's not truthful. Okay, I'm sorry.
It's just word. Okay,
It is a
but
word.
but you know, it's a dad joke for a
Yeah.
reason.
Now, yeah. Anyways, neither here nor there. Let's get back to Harry Potter. We have a few more themes, but I think we should probably just touch on some of the more fun ones. What do you think?
Oh man.
I don't want to go for too long.
Okay.
But we
Okay.
have quite a few points, so maybe we can get back to Harry Potter at some point in the future.
Oh
That
yeah.
was fun.
Well, I think let's talk. Well, let's get on to a serious note, and
Sure.
I think that talking about death. So one thing, and this is the quote that kind of brings it up for me. Dumbledore says to Voldemort in their duel at the Ministry of Magic in the Order of the Phoenix. He says that we both know that there's something that there are things worse than death. And Voldemort says there is nothing worse than death. What do we mean? What does he mean when he says that there are things worse than death? I mean, death has this awful finality to it, and there's no coming back from it. It's very much the end of mortal life.
Mm-hmm.
So, what do you think? What would you say is worse than death?
Death has plagued mankind since the beginning. It's kind of shown up in religious systems. It's formed ancient religious systems and philosophies, informed it and shaped it. It's kind of ironic then that atheism, and we see what atheism is, and this rise of atheism almost puts it under the bed because it doesn't want to deal with it. And it's like one of the only religious systems I can think of that actually does that. I can't really think of any others that do that. Even something like, was it Buddha? Was it Hinduism that like talks about the flame of the candle going out, and the peaceful transition? I can't remember.
I gotta be honest, I'm unfamiliar on that one.
I had to get back to my Eastern philosophy. So let's touch on something I do know a bit more. I could talk about like Stoicism, and the Stoics kind of sitting there saying, you know what, we're gonna greet death like an old friend. Right? I think it was Marcus Aurelius, who basically said, death smiles at every man. The only thing that man can do is smile back. It's this kind of almost defiant look at death, but like, haha, I know you're coming, and that's almost like the comedy of I know you're coming.
Yeah.
And almost trying to get an upper hand on death.
It's the same way that Harry goes willingly into the arena to fight the battle. It's sort of like this, well, it's going to happen. I might as well do it in the best way possible. I might as well willingly encounter the evil.
Mm-hmm. And I think, like, it's a very stoic message in the story of the Deathly Hallows. Because you got the first two brothers who are basically trying to go away from death and trying everything they can to beat death. Whereas the third brother, right, we even read later on after he comes back and he gives back the item to death, or he comes back and greets death like an old friend.
Yeah.
It's a very stoic philosophy.
And he just passes it on to his son and continues to protect his family down to, well,
Harry.
Down to James Potter and therefore Harry Potter.
Yeah.
So that's really cool.
But yeah, it's a very, very stoic philosophy, right? Greeting death like an old friend. The more you fight it, the worse it gets.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. And I think even there's a Christian message in that too, right? We talk about how Christ has broken the power of death. We sing the hymn, "O death, where is your sting?" Because we realize now that death has lost its power. And so we, just like others who greet death like an old friend, we are not afraid of death. And I would suggest then that someone who has power and ambition and has that as their goal in their life, the number one thing that can take all that away is death.
Yeah.
And they cling to the things of this world without realizing that death will break that.
And, you know, not to get, what's the word? Plicky or anything like that. Cliche. But, you know, no one can really take away what you give. And so, in terms of courage and responsibility, being things that you pour out to other people, it's not as if those things are taken away when you die, because that legacy still remains, whereas power and ambition die with you.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of Voldemort and death, the funny thing is, I think death was the worst thing for him, because he had split his soul so many times. You see at the platform of the station at 9 3/4, when Harry's sort of in this in between the dead and the alive world, you kind of see Voldemort's disembodied soul. So I don't know if this was what was. I'm pretty sure this was what was part of Harry.
Right.
Just lying on the ground there. It's now separated from him. I'm assuming that's what it is.
I think so.
Because it's not clear in the books. But I couldn't think of what else it could be. But it's this rotting, like, child-sized bony corpse that's in a significant amount of pain, and it's like, yeah, death really is the worst thing for Voldemort, because he, by virtue of fleeing death, which is what his name means, Voldemort, flee from death, by trying to fly away from it and taking measures against it, he has actually truly made death the worst thing that could possibly happen to him. To be a torturous, non-existence?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's kind of the funny thing about yeah, we see that theme, I think, even coming up in Lord of the Rings. I'm gonna bring it up again.
Oh, yeah.
You thought we were done.
Oh, never.
Bilbo talks about being 111 years old and talking about being, spread thin, like butter scraped over too much bread. Right? And I think we see the same thing with Smeagol. The concept of death at this point in time is, it's almost beyond him. He doesn't even care. He does care, I think, because he does fight for survival in one sense, but it's not like he's dealing with his own death. It's never in his mind. Even when he's got the ring, he's dying in the pits of Mount Doom, and he doesn't care that he's dying. He just cares that he has the ring. Right? It's
the difference, I think, between fighting for his existence versus fighting for his survival.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
And you might think that that's not so different, but it's like, yeah, I don't think it's so much his survival that. I wonder which one of them actually matters to him. His survival is more of an instinctual thing, perhaps.
Yeah.
But his existence, he couldn't care less about. He pours it all into the precious. But
yeah. Going back to the ancient schools of the Greeks, you see this almost. I'd say it's Epicurean. I think is how the Epicureans saw death, and I mean it was a very hedonistic kind of mindset of like, what's the point of living if you don't live? Right, and I think you can kind of see that in Voldemort. His entire life goal was to not die.
Yeah.
You think about how that comes, and it's like that's kind of ironic.
It's unfortunate. The one thing on his bucket list.
Yeah.
Was the thing that he did not achieve.
Yeah, and
it's really too bad, man.
And like, he doesn't. Yeah, and like it becomes his entire life's work to not die, but he didn't live. As an Epicurean might say, right? Like he didn't live. So, yeah, I don't know. Death can be greeted as an old friend. It can be winked at peacefully, or you can flee from it. And I think we see, and Harry Potter, of course, is going to take this a bit more of a. I would say that it takes it on the stoic route of greeting death as an old friend.
But the thing is, when he accepts it, and he accepts it by sacrifice, he becomes the possessor of the Deathly Hallows, and he has control over it, and that's how he comes back.
Right.
Because he now has control over life and death. Now, I don't know if that's for that moment or from then on. I suspect it's not from then on, because I think he dispenses with the wand.
Yeah. There's another character, though, who gives up his immortality in the book. Do you remember his name? Fleming? The creator of the Philosopher's Stone.
Oh, Nicholas Flamel.
Yes, that's his name, Flamel.
That's right.
Because he gives it up, right? At one point, he was, he was how many years old?
He was hundreds of years old. What was it, like, probably the is sort of where medieval alchemy started meeting its end. I think it was like Renaissance era, 1500s or something.
Right. And he gives the stone to Voldemort, or sorry, to Dumbledore as a, I'm done now.
Yeah.
I'm ready to go. Even he accepts death. Anyways, I just thought I'd bring that up. I don't know if it has any relevance to the conversation. But...
Well, I think one thing about... Well, I think it does, because Flamel also, it's not so much he's cheating death. He's done it, like, kind of lawfully. Mm-hmm. He hasn't killed anyone for it, and or whatever is in the process of making a Horcrux. It is certainly killing, but you wonder if there's something else involved. And J.K. Rowling alludes to that and often enough that makes people wonder. Some people think cannibalism, and I wouldn't be surprised. But Nicholas Flamel, it's a lawful. It's a lawful element that he does it by purity as well. That pure things. So there's the Philosopher's Stone not only gives the elixir of life, but it turns any metal into gold.
Yeah.
There's a symbol of purity right there.
Yeah.
So it's not tainted with evil.
No.
But you would have to be dependent on it to continue living.
And I think there's something to be said for the character of Dumbledore, who's basically able to step in and convince him to give it up. Because I think that's kind of what happened. I think he gave it willingly to Dumbledore, but I don't think he gave it willingly without him kind of speaking into that and kind of giving him peace in that. I feel like Dumbledore was kind of the figure of... I forget what it was. They had the characters in the story of the Deathly Hallows were represented as characters in Harry Potter. How I believe it was obviously the character of the guy with the wand, was Voldemort. The character with the cloak was Harry.
And would Snape be the one with the stone?
I think
Stone of Resurrection.
And I think
either way,
Dumbledore was actually the representation of death.
Yeah, I've heard that one plenty. I wonder how deep J.K. Rowling got with that sort of imagery, but there's definitely been very plausible theories like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like the Deathly Hallows. It's a good conversational piece. Some of the other topics we wanted to touch on, and we might actually do so in the future. We were going to talk about death and Dementors, because there's always a fun conversation there about tearing out the soul and the death by that.
Yeah, and then it's just a question of what's the difference between or where's the dividing line between the soul and the body.
Right.
Some things that we will be talking about definitely in the future with other with other franchises. One of them is the Dresden Files. We're going to be talking about this technology versus magic theme and how they don't really mix.
Yeah.
And you see that in Harry Potter as well. But otherwise...
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I wanted to briefly touch on, and we've kind of already touched on, was kind of this idea of awe of imagination.
Oh, yeah.
Right? It's like she's drawing us into the imagination of the world. We see that... we said we wouldn't talk about, we're going to talk about Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. We see that mostly a lot there, where she kind of just introduces us to these creatures, and only some of them are relevant to the story. Mm-hmm. How many of them become just things that we see once and then they go away? And we see that a lot in Harry Potter, where there's just some useful plot devices, but some things we see in the Wizarding world are just completely useless. Right? And I think that is a nice thing, because it's basically, I think she's kind of displaying for us the range of fantasy, as it were. Right? Whereas Tolkien almost has like a distinct use for every piece in his story, she's kind of showing the whimsical, fun side of imagination. I think the different colors of the palette, if you will.
It definitely gets back to one of our earlier points where we're talking about bringing the magic world to us, whereas having us enter Tolkien's world of magic. Very, very different. And I think that's why J.K. Rowling's able to leave the world open-ended in that way. The world kind of lives apart from her. And you can kind of, Cursed Child is technically canon. I call it fan fiction, and you
I
don't
haven't touched it with a 10-foot pole.
And you don't, but people generally don't accept it because it doesn't seem to follow the rules of the already stated universe.
Right.
and this universe is so open-ended, and you just kind of wonder what happens with the characters later, and you can kind of imagine yourself as if you were a student there in Hogwarts yourself. And this world kind of has life apart from the author. So I think that's very impressively done, and when you talk of the awe of imagination, it really gets back to that first point.
Yeah. Which is a good way to wrap it up. If you wanted to have any more conversations about death, souls, the mentors, or technology versus magic before we even get to it, then feel free to have that conversation in the comments. We'd like to see where you guys go with it.
Yeah, we have a Discord server as well, and we've got discussion tabs and everything that haven't been used yet.
Yep.
So,
and if you guys know of anyone who's kind of interested in this kind of content, we'd like to have. We want to be building a community.
Yeah.
And so I'd kind of suggest just sharing this podcast with everyone who would be interested. Or some of the previous episodes. We have episodes on. So far, we have it on the introduction, which was storytelling, and then we've gone through Tolkien, Lewis, and now Rowling. Looking forward, we're going to be going to Star Wars and a few other conversational pieces going forward.
Mm-hmm.
After our first season, which is coming up soon to the end, we're going to be kind of doing deep dives into these things, whereas right now we're kind of just doing a broad stroke of the fantasy genre.
So this first season was always like an introductory season until we can start getting into some of the specifics of contemporary mythology. So what we're going to do after this episode is we're going to do a Star Wars episode, and then we're probably going to do a conclusion episode. We might take a week break in between that to rally up our second season.
Yeah.
But our second season should be longer than our first one, definitely.
Yep. And you know what, the episodes might get longer too, just because again we're doing a bit more of a deep dive on these topics. So. Yeah.
These ones are our overall themes, and we really and we're going to bring it all together in our conclusion to season 1 episode as well. So just a bit of a heads up as to where we're at.
Yep, excellent. And thank you very much.
As always, cheers.